Dwayne, tell us what you've learned in the last 2 days and the last 20 years. Let's welcome Dwayne Beck.
Remember, I'm a slow learner. So what have I learned? One of the things that's really striking for you with the gray hair and the experience is when you come to no-till in the plains 20 years ago, everything was machinery. It was all about the hammer. And if you had the right drill or you had the right sprayer or you had the right tool, then there wasn't any problem. The talks and the stuff that goes on now, it's all about the biology. And the tool that you use that is just a tool. It's not how you get the biology. So that's one of probably the most striking things. And I'm not going to try to cover all the speakers, but just think of some of the people. The one that I think that you need to learn more about is probably Kofi Boa. And he didn't show any pictures of Ghana, but where he works is in a rainforest. But there's dry areas in Ghana. So when I was there, we were training people from dry areas. That was my job, and he was working on the people from the wet areas. But what he talked about was exactly the same thing I talked about. Managing the ecosystem. How do you fit into that natural ecosystem without using fire? Because in the rainforest, fire is what tillage is to us. It's that destructive force. It kind of hits that reset button, gets rid of all the nutrients and whatever. So to us, tillage is a destructive factor. For him, it's fire and tillage is a destructive factor. And then he's trying to cycle things naturally by using the cover crops and utilizing the biology and harnessing the power of the biology. And that's what Gabe Brown talks about, and that's what Wendy talks about. And that's what Odette Menard, I mean, how can you not, if you got a chance to listen to Odette, how can you not love to listen to Odette? I mean, she's just absolutely fascinating in terms of her approach and her earthworms and those kind of things. But it's a biological approach. And Kofi is training farmers. Some of them, or a good share of them, can't read. A good share of them, a large majority of them are women. And Mike Wilson did when I was over at Kofi's and Tony Richards was with me at the time. He's with the Buffett Foundation. But Mike Wilson was there, and he was interviewing these women who didn't speak English. Actually, he had to have a translator, and about how what Kofi had taught them had in fact impacted their lives. And to hear Mike when he came back to the hotel with us at night, and we'd sit around and eat dinner. I wish Mike was here, but Tony's here. We can laugh because we had one choice of food most of the time. You know, they had a huge menu, but you just kind of had one choice, some kind of Chinese dish of some sort. And then one night they said they had pizza tonight. So we ordered pizza. It took about 2 hours. I think they drove someplace and got the pizza and came back. But he talked about how those women, they could now educate their children. And they can now get out of abusive relationships with husbands because they don't necessarily have the same relationship between men and women there that they have here. It was, to me, I came back, and Ruth will tell you this, I came back and I'm really optimistic about Africa being able to develop agriculture that supports itself. Whereas I was not optimistic about that before. It's because Kofi is local, and he now has been given the resources to take that local knowledge of the ecosystem and to use that to develop food production for the local people. The people that work for him get about $3 a day. That's a wage there. People talk about we're going we're going to produce food for the world. They can't afford for us to produce food for them and us transporting it there and whatever. We need to teach them how to produce their own food in their own ways that fit their ecosystem. And it's a biological approach. I ended my last presentation with the term, it's a biological approach to a biological problem. What we have to do is learn to think biologically. And that's really this whole conference. Jonathan Lundgren, Jill Clapperton, Wendy, every one of those speakers, and the farmers, and that's the most important part. The farmers are now starting to think biologically, not mechanically. It used to be the farm boy that came home was the one that really liked the tractors and really liked the combines and really liked the machines. And now maybe we're going to start getting the kids involved that really like the biology, like Paul Brown. Okay? So that's my easy synopsis. Dakota Lakes Research Farm, we've talked about this before. Our native vegetation is a mix to tallgrass prairie. I know this because Lewis and Clark Lewis walked across the southern part of Dakota Lakes Research Farm in 1804. And I've read his journals. So I know what's there. Okay? Missouri River runs right through there. We're right on the edge of the Missouri River. That's where Lewis and Clark came. This area was claimed for first white men really to come and do anything there was the La Vérendrye brothers. They came from Winnipeg. They were French. They claimed this area for France, 1743. And they put a lead plate on the hill over on the west side of Fort Pierre. If you come and want to see it, I'll go show you where they buried it. It's a pretty place. And some kids found it in the early 1900s, 1913 or something. So when French people come to visit, we'll take them there. That's part of their history. They know a lot about that part. We never really talk about that part of our history. We just know we bought this area from France. Well, the reason we did is they came. And then Lewis and Clark came up through there. We're right by that big meander in the river. We knew, if you read their journals, when they made this big meander in the river, because they walked across it, measured it, and then the next thing they talked about was what we call the pocket. And then they came by what we now call DeGray, which is a mile and a half east of me. And the next thing they talk about is Medicine Creek, which is about a mile and a half west of me. So we know exactly when they came across there. It was a lot different landscape than what I found, a lot different vegetation than I found when I started managing Dakota Lakes. It was crested wheatgrass because we'd managed the ecosystem poorly, whoever was there before. But now the mixed grass prairie is starting to come back. Well, what did all these Europeans want? They wanted beavers. They wanted beavers to make hats. So they killed the beavers. And what the beavers had done was the beavers were in all those little tributaries that led into the Missouri River all the way to the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains, but in our case, the Black Hills, and all the way into Montana. In the Grand Tetons, there was beaver dams everywhere. And since there was beaver dams, there was trees in those low areas. Yeah, Gabe, there were trees. They were in the low areas, not on top of the hills. They were in the low areas, behind those beaver dams. And people think beavers are bad for trees, but if beavers were bad for trees, there wouldn't have been any beavers. What they did is put in the dams. The dams would fill with silt. If there was silt, and then they'd move the beaver dam. So we constantly had holding the water and the silt in these dams all up and down. So then the fur trappers came, they killed the beavers. And if you read the bills of lading of all the steamships that came out of the northern Missouri River, hundreds of thousands of beaver pelts would go on those ships, on those boats down. So now we no longer have the dams. And then we let the settlers come in. And by the way, The Revenant, if you go to that movie, happened in western South Dakota. There's no trees there, and there's sure as hell no mountains where Hugh Glass went. But it didn't make a good movie. If you went from Lemon to just north of Pier and took a boat past Dakota Lakes down to Chamberlain, a log. It didn't make a very good movie, so they did it someplace else. But that's a true story. It's an interesting story. But then the settlers came and they overgrazed and they did tillage, and the water started running, and there wasn't beaver dams to stop it anymore. And then we're flooding, and all the white men down the river in St. Louis and Omaha and Kansas City and New Orleans had built their cities right by the river. The Native American farmers that lived there before Columbus came here and before horses came to the Western Hemisphere were farmers. And they grew corn, and they grew squash, and they grew sunflowers. They had 13 kinds of corn. There wasn't any, or very few, hunter-gatherer tribes on the prairies because you'd starve to death. The hunter-gatherer were in the forest. So the Sioux Indians that are there now were from Minnesota where there was trees. They were farmers. But they lived on top of the hills. They didn't live in the river valley because they knew it flooded. So when everything started flooding and flooded Omaha and Kansas City and whatever, what do? We're European. We built a dam. So Pick and Sloan, they decided they'd build 4 large main stem reservoirs in South Dakota, and they planned to put in 500,000 acres of irrigation. But that was all going to be in a glacial lake plain in central and eastern South Dakota. The old glacial Lake Dakota. It's like the Red River Valley. And I actually ran that. My first farm was where they were going to take the water from the Missouri River 150 miles to the east in big canals and gravity irrigate glacial lake soils. And they had to do that because you couldn't possibly grow corn in that country without irrigation. Everybody knew that. So they were growing spring wheat and barley with moldboard plows. You got to have irrigation. I went there to manage irrigation farm, and after the first year, said, I think we can grow corn and soybeans without irrigation if we no-till. And almost was not Dr. Beck because I said that in my PhD orals. And anybody that stupid shouldn't have a... They don't know they're stupid, right? We've been through this before. So there's the Missouri River. There's a big meander. We're right, you see the pocket if you go up, the big meander, then the pocket, and just past the pocket is Dakota Lake. So what happened then in the late 90s? We built these dams. They started filling with silt. People start playing politics with them, and then all of a sudden we got a high rainfall year, and we had flooding. And I took my oldest daughter to Tuscaloosa, Alabama for, was that 2008, something like that, 2009. Took her, she had an internship. So they told us at Pier we're going to start releasing water out of the emergency spillways and everything, and the big tubes underneath the dam. We're going to start releasing that on Monday. You have till then to put up your dikes to protect your city. And we're going down to Alabama, and every place they stop, they're already flooding. They said, boy, sure hope you guys don't turn any more water loose up north. They'd see the South Dakota plate, and we'd go, no, we don't think that's going to happen. We just didn't have the heart to tell them. 7 pipes, 6 feet in diameter, 200 feet ahead, which is a little over 200 feet ahead. They would shoot those streams of water. You can see that they're shooting out there 150, 200 feet. Probably one of the most impressive and distressing things I've ever seen. We can't, for some reason, as Europeans, can't get it through our minds that maybe we should try to fit in with Mother Nature instead of coming to a place and saying, gee, this is a nice place. Let's see if I can change it. Right? And it's not just people who come to Kansas and Nebraska and whatever, the people who go to Australia. They came there, saved these trees, cut down the trees, and started to grow wheat. Wheat isn't anything like a tree. Wheat isn't anything like big blue stem, right? So they were going to irrigate. And that's where I got involved with Dakota Lakes, because the guys out along the river, once some idiot made a center pivot, the reason they're going to take this water over the glacial lake area in the 1940s is nobody had a center pivot. You couldn't irrigate rolling land. You had to have level stuff that you could gravity irrigate. And then some idiot made a pivot. And so the guys out along the river said, well, just water here. And they had pivots at 100 psi at the pivot head, 60, 70 psi at the sprinklers. They put an inch of water on in 25, 30 minutes. And they ran water off. So we started because a bunch of farmers got together and said, we need to stop this runoff. And we'll get the university to do it. And I was actually a graduate student. I said, that's fine, but if you let them own the university, the university own the land, you're going to have all these little small plots. But you're not going to have any systems. So you guys own it, and you help the university run it. Our 11-member board of directors at that time were all irrigators. Not one of them was a no-tiller. But they let me do the things we needed to do. And Ralph Holsworth, who was planning on coming but didn't make it here today, but he was president of the board when I said, if I can no-till, our irrigation pumps will be smaller, we can use less horsepower. We can save a lot of money on machinery as we start this farm. And he said, I know how to farm with tillage. Let's see if we can learn how to farm without tillage. Okay? That's the kind of forethought that we really have amongst lead farmers. We need to utilize those. So we use a water cycle, energy flow, mineral cycle, community dynamics as our basis, this biological-based system instead of mechanical. Does the rain feed plants and recharge the groundwater as it run off? Right, rainfall simulator. Cowgirl Kathy Buttle in her rainfall simulator, right? Going town to town. It doesn't make you think of a Tanya Tucker song, you know, the Rain Man. Right? Anyway, but we know why water runs off. It's because people do tillage. We now put on 2 inches of water in 9 minutes. Look at those rivers hills. That's what Lewis and Clark saw as they walked across the south end of our place, because that's the other side of the river that you see in the background. No runoff of 2 inches in 9 minutes because we have armor, as Jay Fuhrer says. And we have macropores, the worms that Odette talks about. And we protect those macropores with residue. And we grow cover crops to capture nutrients, carbon limited. How many people here irrigate? That's a 20-year wheel track. We've never closed our wheel tracks. You sink in as deep as you do tillage. If you don't do tillage, you don't sink in. Okay? You take the E out of ET, whether it's dry land or irrigated. You make, for you people who don't know, ET is evapotranspiration. Evaporation is water that goes away from your land that makes you no money. Transpiration is water that goes through your plants that makes you money. Take the E out of ET. Make water enter the soil, these macropores and such, and then increase the water holding capacity of your soil. And that's one of the things we're doing with cover crops, is fluffing the soil by adding organic matter. Your fence lines are higher than the land that's been farmed because it has more organic matter. Your land that's been farmed is collapsed. Part of that is stuff that may have blown in there, but a lot of that's because land that's farmed, you take the pore space and organic matter out and it shrinks. So that's a good idea for irrigation. It's a better idea for those without irrigation. And in fact, most of the guys on that board of directors, the ones that are still alive and their families, don't irrigate anymore. Because they make more money by taking the irrigators off and getting rid of them, because it costs a lot of money to pump that water up the hill. And they can grow nearly as good a crops without the irrigation as they could with the irrigation. Ecosystems harvest sunlight energy and drive all other processes. Removing products from the ecosystem reduces the energy available. The worst thing you can do is harvest hay from a field and sell it, especially if it's alfalfa, because you've taken the nutrients and the energy. That energy in that carbon compounds that are there, that drives the ecosystem, whether it's in livestock or if it's in the soil itself. That's the energy that we use. Jay Fuhrer, and I don't know if he showed it, I didn't get to all the things, but Jay Fuhrer talks about farmers and ranchers in North Dakota now. When they make hay on a piece of land that they're going to feed in the wintertime, they leave the hay in that field, bring the cattle to that field, and feed the hay in that field. So the nutrients and the energy stay in that field. And in just a few years, the production of that hay field go up by a bale an acre. Is the energy that you use in the farm, is it constant or limited or finite? Fossil fuels, even though they're cheap today, they're finite. We're going to run out, they're going to be gone, you're going to need to get something else. Sunlight is constant. If the sun doesn't come up tomorrow, it really doesn't matter. Right? If the sun quits coming up, we're just all screwed. It's all done. But if sunlight is what you're harvesting, it's going to come up every day. And it should come up every day until it doesn't come up, and when it doesn't come up, it doesn't matter anymore. But it's beyond imagination. Whereas other sources of energy, no matter what they are, they're going to be finite. Is it benign or potentially damaging? Sunlight, other than possibly causing skin cancer, is benign. Other energy things like fossil fuels, pick on these poor oil guys, are potentially damaging. They're damaging when you go to drill them. The things we're doing to get them out of the ground. I was sitting at a table yesterday, they're talking about the earthquakes in Oklahoma. They go, well, the guys in the country don't really bother them much. They're kind of used to them. I'm going, okay. But sooner or later, that thing might get to be a big earthquake. Okay? So, look at that. Is it internal or external? We are pressing our own oil out of our oilseed crops, using the meal for cow feed and then burning the oil. Money, the money you spend, your 179s or whatever it is, does it build infrastructure? Is it a once-only expense? Or is it consumptive? If you buy a tractor, now you've got to repair it, you got to put fuel in it, and whatever. It's not a once-only expense. I mean, Kofi's guys that go out and whack his rainforest down are different than having a tractor to whack his rainforest down, because you have a tractor to whack his rainforest down, you're going to have repair bales for one thing. A lot of them. It's going to be kind of tough on that thing. But you've got to do something with it. You can't just use it and then not use it. It's a different approach. Is it addictive? If you start using fertilizers and herbicides and tillage and irrigation, if you put up an irrigator, you got to use it. Drain tile. Once you put drain tile in, now you've got that $2 million of expense. You can't afford to not use it. So it's not a biologic approach. It's addictive. Are the nutrients available for plant use and environmental services? Or have they been leached, eroded, transported from the landscape, sent to China, And somebody asked Gabe about that just at the last session. He is cycling his nutrients through his livestock and all the things he's doing. And there's lots of nutrients. Remember a phosphorus test, and I saw Ray walked in over here someplace. A phosphorus test that Ray runs does not tell you how much total phosphorus you got there. It tells you how available or how soluble that phosphorus is. Doesn't tell you how much. And as you add mycorrhizae and you have lots of root activity and whatever, you'll actually take phosphorus that's in these unavailable forms and kind of transform it into more available forms. That's what Jay is seeing. But if he was taking everything off, you send almost nothing off of your land if all you're selling is the meat. Analyze that steak for how much phosphorus is in it and potassium, whatever. Not a lot in there. It's when it goes off as grain or goes off as biomass. Ecosystems that leak nutrients turn into deserts. Native systems do not leak nutrients, but a 120-car train of soybeans is 400,000 pounds of pea. But Gabe is using his grain, a lot of his grain, most of his grain is getting used and recycled right back in through the system. That's a different thing, and that's one of the reasons I talk about livestock and why they're important. Saline seeps, if you have them, your water system is broken, and that's costing you to lose your fertilizer. The thing that's in a saline seep is fertilizer. If you don't believe me, take a soil sample, send it to Ward Labs, and Ray will tell you how much fertilizer you have in a saline seep. And he'll tell you what's in there. I'll tell you first, it's nitrates, lime, gypsum. Am I close, Ray? Okay. Catch and release nutrients. I'm going to take that time. There's wheat stubble on the left that we did nothing with, and wheat stubble on the right that we put hay millet into and some other things, and that's going to be a grazer. We'll soft and graze that. We've captured sunlight and added carbon to the system. We've also taken that wheat stubble and turned it into something that's a different color, and it's more benevolent to plant into. We've even done stuff like this where we have tall ones and short ones. The tall ones are the forage sorghums, sedans, and the little one is hay millet, which has a waxy leaf. And you swath it right, you put the hay millet on top of the forage sorghum sedan, and that kind of is a roof on the thing. We don't always get that fancy, but it was kind of cute to try doing that. A lot of mixtures are good, but you don't need everything. And one of the things you have to be cognizant of is not taking disease from one crop to another. So we got a lot of guys using peas in cover crops or lentils, and they want to grow peas and lentils. I'm not sure that's a good idea. You'll see things growing at different times. There's a mixture that's got cowpeas is what you see, and then other things underneath, and the other things underneath come as soon as the cowpeas die. So catch and release nutrients. And the thing we use to release those nutrients may be livestock. The thing I said in my session this morning, and I know not all of you were there, but one of the reasons for having livestock is that in cold areas and dry areas, soil biology stops for appreciable periods of the year when we're cold or when we're dry. And what happens with ruminant animals is that keeps the biology rolling during those cold periods because the rumen is warm during the winter, and during the dry periods because the rumen is moist during the dry period. And so you don't have them lag phases when you come back out of that, and you can utilize that period of time. Charles Darwin called the rumen, or the soil, the rumen of the earth. A lot of the biology in the soil is identical to the biology in rumen. In fact, as a cow grazes, she picks up the soil biology, and a baby calf doesn't really have that biology. It gets it from its mother, and it gets it from the soil when it starts to graze. Do many species have fairly stable populations of all ages, or does a population of just a few species fluctuate wildly? The reason we have insect outbreaks is we try to kill everything out there. And then all of a sudden we have somebody come in, we have this big fluctuation, this big influx of the predators, or the pests. But we have a nice, big, diverse population of predators out there. It's not a big problem. We haven't used a broadcast insecticide in 14 years, which is kind of interesting. Weeds and diseases are Mother Nature's way of adding diversity to a system that lacks it. If you have a problem, you have provided the opportunity. We've learned that. You know, Jonathan, all these things. Jonathan Lundgren talked about the things I just talked about. And reviewing what people say, these are nothing new, but it's a biological thing. You notice we're not talking a lot about machinery. Does the action address the weakest point in the life cycle of the organism? Resistant weeds. When are we trying to kill our weeds? We wait till they're up. Right? It's like doing birth control by killing teenagers. Right? I mean, the hell are we thinking? The weakest time in the plant's life is before it's born. Keep it from having seeds. Keep the mother from growing. Be smarter than the weed. Think about what you're trying to do, but we just wait, well, they're going to come up, we're going to spray it now. That's our whole weed control program in the United States. It doesn't make any sense, and that's why we have resistant weeds. The best thing we can do to prevent the weeds and address that problem is to add diversity of our own, and that's what Gabe does. Now, Gabe isn't using herbicides, and we got the question a lot of times in France when Ruth and I was there last winter when we were there. They wanted to be no-till organic, and I, with the language barrier and the translators and whatever, I finally just start saying, well, I think we can do it. You can do it, but you need 7 species. I had no clue. But I walked in the speaker's lounge today and said something like that to Gabe, and he gets out a pencil and paper, and he said, what species? I have no idea, right? But if we're going to add that diversity and take care of these things, I know chickens for bugs and those kind of things, and horses for Canadian thistle and whatever. And when I said horses for Canadian thistle, then he lost interest in that part of it. So no-till is not about lack of tillage. It's about managing soil, water, soil structure, soil biology, and carbon compounds in the soil, and the big one's the carbon. It's all about carbon. Carbon is that energy that drives the system. We went through it today. We had a little quiz, and I can't do this with Ray because he can do parts per million, see? The atmosphere has 300 parts per million, 340 parts per million carbon dioxide in this room. And everybody, if I would ask them at one time, what's the limiting factor in ecosystem, they say, oh, I need nitrogen. Well, there's 79% nitrogen in this room, which is 790,000 parts per million versus 300 parts per million. The limiting factor is the carbon to have the energy to drive those processes that take nitrogen from the air, put them into the soil. As farmers, you need to decide what you would like agriculture to look like in the future. Gabe had some opinions. But you need to decide that, not Farm Bureau, not corn, the U.S. Corn Council, corn growers, not soybean, not wheat, not cattlemen. You as farmers, you grow all these things. I get a big kick out of these commodity groups. They're all fighting each other, and the farmer back home is paying money into all of them and to fight each other because he grows all those things. I think our present path is troubling. And if we do not define ourselves and clean up our messes and whatever, somebody will do that for us. Use 200 years as a timeline. We actually use 600 years at Dakota Lakes to say, okay, what do we think we want to be doing in 600 years? Now, we probably don't have a clue. But what would you like it to be? Somebody asked Gabe, what would you like it to be in 20 years? And he said, well, I'd like to be fishing. And you need to ask Paul, but you need to have, as a community of farmers, some kind of an idea of what you would like to see happen. Never in history have we faced the kind of problems that we're probably going to face in terms of food insecurity around the world. But we're not going to feed them from here. And is climate going to change? I think it's going to change. I don't know how it's going to change. I don't think anybody does. But we know this. World War II, we didn't know was coming. We didn't know some of the volcanoes and stuff that have impacted. We didn't know it was coming. This we know, that if we don't do something to save our soils and whatever, we're going to be screwed. And we need to figure this out pretty soon. We don't have time to say, well, let's have a committee meeting to plan a committee meeting to have, right? And we're negotiating a new, Dakota Lakes is negotiating a new agreement with SDSU, and it's kind of funny because we have the guys in our room, board members, that can sign that agreement. But when we send it into the university, you got to go through all these things, and then it gets changed and it comes back. And the board members are frustrated. They say, well, we want somebody in this room that can sign that agreement, that has the authority to sign and make that agreement with us, and then we'll hammer it out and get her done. Don't think that's going to happen, but you guys can do that, and that's what you need to do. Decide how you're going to do it. Research needs to be transformational, thinking long term, not incremental. And I used an example in my earlier talk today, but I'm going to bring it up again. We interviewed for the director of the West River Ag Center. I was on the committee. Had two final candidates. I asked both of them, do you think there'll be feedlots in 50 years? And one of them said no, and one of them said probably not, which surprised me. And I said, how are you plan to change the research program at this ag center to reflect that change? If there's not going to be feedlots, right now you're got a whole program that's focused on making feeder calves that go into feedlots. How are you going to change the program? And I got a bunch of these things like, well, we're going to have stakeholder meetings and listening meetings. And I said, you're the scientist, you're the expert. How are you going to anticipate this change? Because I tell you, if I would have had a listening meeting with a bunch of farmers in 1983, I don't care if it's Kansas or Nebraska or South Dakota, and I said, what do you want? There's not one farmer who said, what I need is diverse no-till rotations. Right? We have to start finding people and thinking differently as a group to say, what's the science, what's that telling us? Not where we think we can get to or whatever. Where do you think we need to go? Where we're going to meet this future? Because it's going to be different. 80% of the total input costs in agriculture can be traced directly to energy. 120 years ago, that was zero. 120 years from now, fossil energy will have to be zero again. No big deal. Fossil fuels will just be a small blip in mankind's history. I know we don't think of it that way now, but it's only going to be a 150-year period. The glaciers that formed South Dakota, eastern South Dakota, are 17,000 years ago. Your geology here is way older than that. In 200 years of it, we have this little thing in there that fossil energy was big. We will be fossil fuel neutral by 2026. Focus on systems, not details, outputs, not inputs. Notice Gabe was, if you listen to him talk, he's talking about, well, I'm producing this and this and this, not really, I'm feeding this and this. It's outputs. Action, not reaction. I talk about whack-a-mole management. How many of you people have played whack-a-mole with your kids? That's the way we farm. Got this weed, whack. Whoop, damn, whack. Right? Whoop. Come on, we can do better than that. Commitment, not involvement. At breakfast this morning, the chicken was involved. The pig was committed. I don't know how many times I tell it, people still laugh. I mean, been around forever. Science and reason, we've got all this stuff I saw on the internet. I mean, I love going through all these goofy dang ideas that come up, that people think of. Taking your tractor exhaust and putting it into the soil is going to make everything better. Remember that one? Do the math. Surface 6 inches, per acre is 2 million pounds. How many liters or gallons of diesel fuel do you have to burn to make an impact on that? We had a guy stop at the farm, wanted to take the water from the Mississippi, pump it west of the 100th meridian, and grow crops to produce ethanol. And he had people giving him money. You know, it just made no sense. Emotion and rumors, we got to get rid of those. Look into the facts. And the internet really lets us find things, but it also gives people a chance to do a bunch of goofy stuff. Address the problem instead of treating the symptom. We've spent a lot of time with NRCS and universities and whatever treating the symptoms instead of going back to the root. When you have runoff, stop the water from running. Don't build a terrace to keep it in the field or to stop it from causing an issue. And terraces are fine. And if we had drills that could drill over the terraces, it'd be great. So we could farm it in straight lines and still have the terraces there, be fine. But that wasn't the way to address that problem. It was treating a symptom. I have learned more from observing nature than trying to change it. Take time to look at what Mother Nature's doing. Mother Nature's been managing ecosystems better and for longer than anyone else. She's done a really good job at it. I love these gene jockeys that we have. At the university, I have all these gene jockeys, and they're just making these transformations, and they're doing it at Monsanto and whatever, and they come out with them, and Mother Nature looks at their newest, greatest thing and goes, "You amateurs, try this," right? And then they come up with another transformation or another combination of herbicide, and she goes, "Oh, you want me to make it resistant to 2 herbicides? I can do that." I mean, she harvests the maximum amount of sunlight. Look at a natural ecosystem. She doesn't waste that. She leaks very few nutrients, including carbon dioxide from the system. She cycles her carbon dioxide. And when you lose your carbon dioxide from the system, your organic matter goes down. I just love talking about the salmon in the West Coast. They lose nutrients from their ecosystems, and they go down the streams into the river with it. And the salmon harvests nutrients from the ocean, come swimming up the river, the bear eats the salmon, the nutrients are back. See? She doesn't leak them. They come back. If she doesn't, they would turn into deserts. She makes maximum use of water and nutrients by having webs of mycorrhizae and all these other tricks that all these people told you about over the last day and a half. She uses animals, big ones and little ones, as part of the system. A few years ago, Ruth organized a no-till conference that we held in association with our annual meeting, and we called it All Creatures Great and Small. And we talked about no-till, and we talked about microbiology, and you could have done that title for this conference, because that's really one of the things we talked about, is all creatures great and small. It's nice to have the cows back. If you look at the next Farm Journal, if you get the Farm Journal and read those articles that Howard Buffett sponsors, mine's going to be called "The Cows Have Come Home." Because they belong there. The bison was there. We can't really manage that ecosystem unless we have the cows. And we're doing swath grazing, and we're doing stock grazing, and we're going to develop a way to automate the livestock on the land. And Gabe and I talked about it. He goes, I just love to go out and move fences. And I'm glad that Gabe loves to go out and move fences. And if he wants more pleasure, he can come to my place and move fences if he wants. I'll feed him and everything. I don't like moving the fences. I like going out and talking to my cows and looking at the cows, but I would like it better when we have it on our irrigator, which we do right now, and it moves by itself. So I push a button, and the cows like that too, because it gets done faster. But they cycle the nutrients. There's Dan Forgy. He's running around here someplace. These cows, he's got them trained so much they're waiting to fertilize that area until he tells them whether, takes these soil tests and tells them whether they should or not. Use of perennial sequences or perennial cover crops will probably be necessary. And my favorite story there has to do with Australia, because we have some Australians in the audience, maybe. They're still here. Got the Aussies here yet? Yeah, they're here. I was in Western Australia, and we went to a field where they're trying to grow sorghum, and it looked obviously very drought-stressed. And one of the guys was saying, I told you we couldn't grow sorghum, it's too droughty here and whatever. And we pulled into the paddock, because we're in Australia, and we had the ute, and we pulled into the paddock. And the only place that sorghum looked decent was right around the big tree, right in the middle of the paddock. Well, my South Dakota intuition said, well, if it's drought stress around the tree, it should be more drought stressed than it is in the field, but it was the opposite. Out in the field, it looked really drought stressed. Around the trees, it looked great. And I said, gee, what happened there? It should be worse around the tree. And he said, well, it cracked the soil and the water moved to the surface where the tree is and whatever. And I'm going, I don't think so. We're going to test Ray. So what is that? Potassium deficiencies. Attaboy, Ray. They had so much leaching going on because they don't have the water cycle right. The potassium away from the tree went deep, and the sorghum couldn't get it, but where the tree was, it's cycling the potassium back to the surface and dripping it out. And there was 100 parts per million potassium where the tree was and 5 parts per million where the tree wasn't. Okay? If you've got we're going to have to do something to make sure we're cycling better. If your pHs is going down, those kind of things. She does not do tillage, and she does not export nutrients. All tillage tools destroy soil structure. All tillage tools decrease water infiltration. All tillage tools reduce organic matter, and all tillage tools increase weeds. And Randy Anderson told you that one, right? He did a lot of that research on some of our stuff. Mother Nature does not care which species survive or die. We do not need to change our habits to save nature or the planet. The nature and the planet will go on without us. We need to do these things so our descendants, our children, our children's children. And when we were testing the mic, when I was doing this thing, we were testing the mic. That was on purpose. But we were talking about a wedding and grandchildren. Right? Talk to anybody in this room, older guys, except Ruth and I, they talk about their grandchildren. And then hopefully the grandchildren are going to have grandchildren. So we have to do these things for that reason, not for any altruistic reason. It makes no sense for North America, South America, or Europe to degrade our ecosystem and attempt to feed people and also produce fuel and fiber from land. We need to keep that for food. I have a friend of mine that's heavily into the biomass, breeding the switchgrass and whatever. He's got a saying, he said, biomass is the energy source of the future and always will be. Think real hard about that. It'll always be in the future. Not now. Okay? Kofi Boa gave me tremendous optimism that if we help the Africans solve their own problems, and when they have a problem in Africa, it's not a biological problem. You can grow any dang thing you want to in that rainforest. It's phenomenal. it's a political problem. But it makes no sense for us to degrade our ecosystem. Bureaucracies, governments, and corporations are operated by people with limited tenure. They don't stay there very long, and they therefore have short-term goals. Some of the politicians stay there way too damn long, but not by the standards of families, right? Families stay there forever, hopefully. Society and landowners and farmers deserve to have long-term research. I have learned more from farmers than they have learned from me. So, I steal everything. I steal your thoughts. When you come up with good ideas, I steal them. I steal Rick Beaver's slides, whatever. I don't care. I steal everything. But I hopefully put them together so they're helpful to other people. Farmers and ranchers harvest sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce products they can sell. Think of Gabe. He's just producing products, everything from ducks to nuts, you know. Everything from soup to nuts. He had soup, bones, and nuts, right? I got everything from soup to nuts. You can use that, Gabe. Gabe's still in here? Yeah. Some of this is human food, and we need to be aware of nutrition issues and off-site impacts. Think of how that fits into the theme of this session. I've had this slide for a long time. If we want to eat beef, maybe we should concentrate on producing beef instead of producing corn and soybeans or barley that feeds beef and feedlots. Have a friend of mine who had a brother that was in Afghanistan during the period after 9/11, and then period before 9/11, whatever. This was taken right after 9/11, but the Afghan farmers were having trouble producing crops. It's dry country, and Owen came back for a furlough, and you know, this was before we had troops in there. He was doing missionary type work, humanitarian work. And he went to his brother's, the old home place, and he saw how much no-till had helped, and they came down to me, and we got him a no-till drill, and he's drilling with a Belarus tractor. But it didn't work well in Afghanistan because there's no residue. It's all about carbon. Where did the residue go? Well, Abdul took it. And if you look real closely, he pulled it up by the roots. Because in Muslim societies, if you leave the residue out there, it belongs to the community, so he takes it all, puts it on his semis and on his straight trucks, and he hauls it into the building to feed his livestock or to burn or whatever. They're so carbon short. But they also don't realize the value of that. And when Ruth and I were first married, we looked at working on a project in Morocco. And in order to keep the residue on the field, we had to hire a guardian to spend his days in the field keeping people from grazing and taking the residue. And he thought he had the best idea. Sat in a tent out there in the field and told people not to graze it when they came by. You know, I think he thought we're grazing Americans. I mean, what a deal. What a job. And when we were in Morocco, the king had declared a holiday one day, and we went out traveling through the country, and I'm thinking, well, we're here to help these people, and geez, you know, I wasn't really thinking no-till was a thing. I looked at how the guy was doing tillage. He had a camel and donkey hooked together. Thinking, boy, he's not very efficient. We should get that guy a tractor. And I tried to take a picture of it, and all of a sudden I was kind of hiding in behind some bushes, and I heard this shoof, shoof, which I found out meant come and look. And the landowner's there. That's the guy holding the plow, and the guy that works for him is in the background. But he wanted to show me. And we had a translator along, and he's showing me how they're plowing the ground with a camel and donkey. He's explaining it. He said, the people who work for me think if you took two animals of the same species together, the animals can conspire against the driver and you can't get any work done. But he said the real reason is that the camel's hard to train, the donkey's easier to train, so we hook the camel to the donkey and they learn to follow the donkeys around when they're little. And then you just drive the donkey and the camel does the work. So if you think about no-till in the plains, the one on the left is probably Steve and the one on the right is Doug. But at one time in not too distant past, they had enough wealth to build this fort. And that's my lovely wife. And we do have old pictures of Ruth, too, for you people who got to see the old pictures of me. They built that at one time. They were rich. They actually owned all of Spain at one time. But the thing that happened is that tillage, whether it's done by tractors or by camels, caused this kind of erosion, and that's as good a productivity as they could get out of their soil. It was too late. It's too late for Morocco. It's too late for a lot of those countries in the Middle East because they've already degraded their soils to the point they probably can't get them back in our lifetimes. We saw the same thing in Europe. So all these great castles in France, and all around the castles, we saw this. Our ancestors, almost all of us in here, our ancestors came to North America because the ecosystem and the farming in Europe was degraded so badly we had to go find new ground to degrade. Let's quit doing that. That's mining, it's not farming. Those are actually farm fields in France. Peak oil, peak phosphorus. Right? Talking about peak oil when it's half gone, peak phosphorus is half gone. Peak soil? Maybe we're already there. Soil's half gone. We need to stop it now. The best time to make transformational change, have your brain transplant, was 600 years ago. We should have stopped doing this 600 years ago. Second best time is now. There may not be another chance. Take the E out of E.T., take the T out of can't. Doing the right thing environmentally is almost always the correct economic approach in the long run. Think about that. Thank you.